What if the greatest monster in history was never outside of us? What if it was born the moment a single human being, standing alone in the dark, first understood that one day they would die? Somewhere, tens of thousands of years ago, a human being looked at the body of someone they loved. And for the first time, they understood. This was not sleep. This was not absence. This was the end. No warning. No explanation. Just silence where a voice used to be. That moment, that single, unbearable realization, may be the most important event in the history of the human mind. Not fire. Not tools. Not language. Fear. Because before that moment, there was only instinct. Hunger. Cold. Pain. But after that moment, there was dread. The awareness that this, all of it, will end. And once a mind knows that, it can never go back to not knowing it. Scientists call it mortality salience. Philosophers call it the awareness of finitude. But the first humans who felt it didn't have words for it. They just had the fear. Raw. Unfiltered. Total. And that fear didn't disappear. It became the foundation of everything we would build next. Because to survive that fear, the human mind had to invent something extraordinary. And what it invented would go on to shape every war, every god, every crime, and every nightmare that followed. Around 100,000 years ago, something strange begins to appear in the archaeological record. Bodies, deliberately placed. Positioned with care. Sometimes surrounded by flowers, ochre, or tools. This is not survival behavior. Burying the dead offers no biological advantage. It is something else entirely. It is the first evidence of a mind trying to make sense of an unbearable truth. Because here is the terrifying paradox at the center of being human. We are the only species, as far as we know, that understands it is going to die, long before it happens. A deer does not lie awake at night contemplating its own mortality. A bird does not grieve for the future. But we do. And that gap, between knowing and living, became the deepest wound in the human psyche. Some anthropologists believe this is where religion was born. Not from wonder. From terror. The first prayers may not have been thanks. They may have been please. Please, let this not be the end. Please, let there be something more. But if death terrified early humans this much, how did they survive it, night after night, without losing their minds completely? The answer, psychologists argue, was meaning. If death cannot be avoided, the mind needs something else to hold on to. A story. A purpose. A reason. None of this is random. This idea has a name in modern psychology, terror management theory. It proposes that much of human culture, religion, nationalism, art, legacy, even the drive to have children, exists, at least in part, to shield us from the terror of our own mortality. We build monuments so a piece of us outlives our bodies. We tell stories of an afterlife so the end is not truly the end. We raise children so something of us continues. We create God so the universe is not empty and indifferent. None of this makes those things false. But it does suggest something haunting. Much of what we call civilization may be, in part, an elaborate defense system against a single, unbearable fact. And when that defense system cracks, even slightly, something ancient and primal breaks through. Because when the fear of death couldn't be contained by meaning alone, humanity found a far darker way to manage it. And it changed the course of history. If death could not be defeated, it could at least be explained. And if it could be explained, it could be controlled. Early societies built entire systems around this single idea. Priests who claimed to know what happens after death gained enormous power, because the fear of the unknown made people desperate for certainty, at any cost. Kings who claimed divine right ruled not through strength alone, but through the fear of cosmic punishment. Laws were often less about justice, and more about controlling the terror of chaos, the fear that without strict order, everything collapses into death and disorder. Even punishment itself became theater. Public executions in ancient and medieval societies were not just justice. They were fear, weaponized, a visible reminder to entire populations of exactly how fragile life could be, and exactly who controlled that fragility. This is the darker truth historians rarely say out loud. Fear of death has been one of the most effective tools of power in the entire history of civilization. Not because people are foolish, but because the fear is real, and ancient, and impossible to fully silence. But fear doesn't only shape nations and religions. It reshapes something even more personal, the individual human mind. And that's where the story turns truly dark. For the individual human being, the fear of death rarely stays abstract for long. It becomes personal the moment tragedy touches a life directly, the loss of a parent, a child, a war, a plague. Historians and psychologists studying trauma across centuries have found something remarkable. The human mind, faced with overwhelming fear, doesn't just feel afraid. It changes. Survivors of medieval plagues wrote of a strange numbness that settled over entire towns, a psychological state we would now recognize as collective trauma, centuries before the word trauma even existed. Soldiers returning from ancient wars described visions, night terrors, and an inability to feel joy, symptoms strikingly similar to what we today call post-traumatic stress. Entire communities, faced with unexplainable death, famine, disease, disaster, often turned that fear outward. They searched for someone to blame. A witch. A stranger. An outsider. Someone whose death might explain, and therefore control, the death that could not be understood. This is one of the darkest patterns in human history. When fear becomes unbearable, the mind often prefers a villain to an unanswerable question. And that single tendency, to turn unbearable fear into blame, may be responsible for some of the cruelest chapters in human history. Throughout history, fear of death has repeatedly transformed into something psychologists call moral panic, a collective, often irrational search for someone to punish. Witch trials across Europe. Persecutions during plagues. Purges during wars. Each one followed a chillingly similar psychological pattern. First, an unbearable, unexplainable threat. Death, arriving without warning, without reason. Second, unbearable uncertainty. The human mind cannot tolerate chaos indefinitely. Third, a target. Someone, anyone, the fear can be pointed at. And fourth, relief. Temporary, false, but real relief, because now the terror has a face, a name, a solution. This is not ancient history alone. Modern psychology shows this same pattern resurfacing again and again, in new forms, in every generation. Fear doesn't disappear as societies become more advanced. It simply changes its costume. Which raises an uncomfortable question the rest of the story cannot avoid. If fear of death has shaped religion, power, punishment, and mass hysteria for tens of thousands of years, how much of what we call human nature is really just fear, wearing different masks? To answer that, we have to go somewhere even darker, into the mind of the individual, alone, facing fear with nothing and no one to hide behind. There is a particular kind of fear that has followed humans since before recorded history, the fear of being alone with your own mind, in the dark, with nothing to distract you from the truth. Psychologists call it existential dread, the raw, unfiltered awareness of mortality with no belief system, no ritual, no distraction standing between the mind and the abyss. Ancient philosophers wrote about it. Religious mystics feared it. Modern psychology studies it in clinical detail. And across every culture, in every era, humans developed the same defense: noise, stories, songs, prayers, companionship, constant distraction. Because silence, for the human mind, has never been empty. Silence is where the first fear still lives. Perhaps that is why isolation has always been one of the cruelest punishments a society could invent, not chains, not cages, but simply being left alone with the mind, and the truth it cannot unknow. And perhaps that is why, even now, in an age of endless distraction, notifications, screens, noise, so many people still feel that same ancient dread the moment everything goes quiet. Because the truth is this: the first fear never left us. It didn't disappear with civilization. It just went underground, waiting, in every silence, for us to notice it again. So where does this leave us? Perhaps the fear of death is not simply a flaw in the human mind. Perhaps it is the very thing that built it. Every cathedral, every law, every song written about loss, every act of courage in the face of danger, all of it, in some way, traces back to that first unbearable moment when a human being understood they would not live forever. Fear built our gods. Fear built our governments. Fear built our art, our rituals, our sense of right and wrong. And fear, when left unchecked, also built our cruelty, our witch hunts, our wars, our search for someone else to blame for a truth too large to face alone. The first fear was not a weakness. It was the beginning of consciousness itself, the moment a species became aware enough to suffer, and therefore aware enough to seek meaning. Maybe that is the most unsettling realization of all. The greatest monster in human history was never a creature in the dark. It was the mind, alone, discovering for the first time that everything ends. And everything we call civilization, every law, every belief, every act of kindness or cruelty, may simply be humanity's oldest, longest answer to that first, unbearable fear. So the next time the silence feels a little too heavy, remember. You are not imagining it. You are feeling the oldest fear our species has ever known. And you are not alone in it. You never have been. Before we go any further, if stories like this, about the darker corners of the human mind, fascinate you as much as they fascinate me, hit subscribe now. Because we're about to go somewhere very few documentaries dare to go. If this made you see fear differently, even for a moment, like this video, and subscribe for more deep dives into history, psychology, and the darker side of the human mind. Tell me in the comments, what's the oldest fear you remember feeling? And if you know someone who loves mystery, history, or psychology as much as you do, send them this video. Some truths are better shared than faced alone. See you in the next one.